The bag hit the floor of the Fairchild Ranch house with a sound like a gunshot, and every word Etta Garrison had swallowed for 14 months rose in her throat like flood water behind a breaking dam. "I am leaving," she said, and her voice did not shake, which was the most terrifying thing Orville Fairchild had ever heard in his 31 years of living. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, his hat still on his head, trailed dust on his shoulders, and he stared at the worn leather satchel sitting at her feet like it was a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. Because it was. Because she meant it. He could see that she meant it in the way she held her chin, in the way her green eyes had gone perfectly, devastatingly calm. "Etta," he said, and that was all, just her name. Just one word, because he was Orville Fairchild, and Orville Fairchild did not beg, did not plead, did not lay himself open like a wound for anyone to see. "Do not say my name like that," she said quietly. "Like it is enough, like it has ever been enough." He moved into the room, his boots crossing the pine floorboard slowly, like a man approaching something wild that might bolt. "Where are you going to go?" The question landed like a slap, and she felt the sting of it, that old, familiar deflection, the way he answered every real thing with a practical thing, the way he turned every moment of raw truth into logistics, into ranching problems, into something that could be managed and contained and never ever felt. "That is not the question," Etta said. She pressed her hand flat against the satchel. "And you know it." He stopped 3 feet from her. The lamplight caught the angle of his jaw, the muscle working there, the thing he was holding back. There was always something he was holding back. That was the secret she had lived inside of for over a year, the hidden truth that had worn her down to something thin and breakable. Orville Fairchild was full of feeling, desperately, overwhelmingly full of it, and he would rather swallow every last drop than hand a single word of it to another human being. "Stay," he said, "just that, just the one word." And she looked at him for a long moment, this man she had loved so completely it had at times felt like a dark secret she carried alone, and she picked up her bag. That was when he finally spoke. Not the one word, not the deflection, not the logistics. He finally, at last, after 14 months of silence that had cost them both more than either could calculate, said the thing he had been too proud to say first. But to understand what he said, and why it broke her open and put her back together in the same breath, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the spring of 1882 in Coulter's Creek, New Mexico territory, and to a woman who had come west with a trunk full of school books and a heart full of stubborn, unshakable hope. Etta Garrison had arrived in Coulter's Creek on the 3rd of April, 1882, on the back of a rickety stagecoach that had lost a wheel twice between Santa Fe and the territory line. She was 26 years old, possessed of dark auburn hair she kept pinned firmly at the nape of her neck, and a no-nonsense disposition that had made her an excellent schoolteacher in Cincinnati and would, she intended, make her an even better one here. She had not come west for a man. That point was important to her, and she would make it repeatedly in the weeks that followed to anyone in Coulter's Creek who made assumptions, which was nearly everyone. She had come west because the territory needed teachers, because the salary was double what Ohio could offer, and because she had spent 26 years doing exactly what was expected of her, and she had decided finally, fiercely, to do something that was hers. The town of Coulter's Creek was smaller than the map had suggested. It had a main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Dusty Pearl, a church, a small jailhouse, and a scattering of homes. The schoolhouse sat at the eastern edge of town and was in considerably worse repair than the advertisement had implied, but Etta had looked at the cracked window and the sagging door and felt something that surprised her. She felt determination so clean it was almost like joy. She was staying at the boarding house run by a woman named Mabel Cortez, a wide-shouldered, good-natured woman of Mexican descent who had lived in the territory for 30 years and knew every single piece of business that happened within 20 miles of town. Mabel had taken one look at Etta stepping off the stage with her trunk and her satchel and her uncompromising chin, and had said, in a tone of great approval, "Good. You look like someone who will not leave in a month." "I will not leave at all," Etta had said, and meant it completely, with no idea of how complicated that promise would become. It was Mabel who first mentioned Orville Fairchild, on Etta's third day in Coulter's Creek, over a breakfast of cornbread and salt pork. "The man who owns the big spread north of town will likely be needing to arrange something for his younger brothers with the school," Mabel said, pouring coffee with the air of someone delivering useful intelligence. "He has had 2 boys living with him since their mother passed. They are 9 and 11, smart boys but running wild since the last teacher left." "What is the man's name?" Etta asked. "Orville Fairchild. Runs cattle, keeps to himself. Good man but difficult." Mabel paused and seemed to choose her next words with the care of someone diffusing something explosive. "He does not say much, but what he does is always worth watching." Etta had absorbed this information and filed it away as a practical matter. She would need to meet with the ranchers and farmers whose children would attend her school. This Orville Fairchild was simply one of them. She met him 10 days later. She had ridden out to the Fairchild ranch on a borrowed horse, a placid brown mare named Clover, with a notebook in her saddlebag and a list of questions about the boys' educational backgrounds. She had sent word ahead with the general store owner's son, so she expected to find someone prepared for her arrival. What she found was a man on the roof of his barn. He was nailing down shingles that the recent wind had torn loose, moving with the economical confidence of someone who had done it 100 times, and he did not come down when she rode into the yard. He looked at her from up there, his hammer pausing, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of a battered brown hat. "Mr. Fairchild." She called up. "That's me," he said. "I am Etta Garrison, the new school teacher. I sent word I was coming." "I got the word." He drove another nail. "Come back in an hour." She had stared up at him for a moment, genuinely uncertain whether she was more offended or amused. She chose amused, barely, and tied Clover to the fence post and took out her notebook and sat on the top rail of the fence and waited, writing notes about the condition of the land, the quality of the fencing, the number of cattle she could see, because she was a woman who used her time. 40 minutes later he came down from the roof. He was taller than she had expected. Long-legged and lean in the way that came from real work rather than fashion, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and a face that was angular and weathered, and she noted with some irritation, extremely handsome in a severe, unsmiling way. He pulled off his work gloves as he walked toward her and did not apologize for making her wait, which struck her as either supremely rude or supremely honest. "Miss Garrison," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. "Mr. Fairchild." His grip was firm and brief. "Come inside." The house was clean and plain and had the particular quality of a place kept orderly by someone who had strong feelings about disorder. There were no decorations beyond a single framed daguerreotype on the mantel, which she later learned was his parents', and a child's drawing tacked to the kitchen wall that she later learned was done by his youngest brother, Clem. He put coffee on without asking if she wanted any and sat across the kitchen table from her with his arms folded on the table and looked at her with the kind of attention that was both flattering and slightly unnerving. "Tell me what you need from me for the boys," he said. She told him. She was organized and clear and professional, and he listened without interrupting, which she appreciated. His younger brothers, she learned, were named Clem, who was 9, and Harlan, who was 11. Their mother, Orville's mother as well though by a different father, had died the previous autumn of pneumonia. Their father had been dead since Orville was 19. Orville had been raising those boys, managing the ranch, and apparently having no social life whatsoever for going on 2 years. "What are their strengths?" she asked, her pencil ready. He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it, and that surprised her. Most men she had dealt with would have said something vague. He said, "Clem has a memory like a trap. Tell him something once and it is in there forever. Harlan is good at reasoning. He works things out logically, but he gives up if something embarrasses him." Etta had written it down and looked up at him with something approaching respect. "You pay attention to them. They're mine to look after," he said, as though that were sufficient explanation. And perhaps it was. She had ridden back to town that afternoon with her notes and a peculiar feeling she could not quite name. Not attraction, she told herself firmly. Not yet. Just the faint pull of finding something more interesting than she expected. She was wrong about the not yet part. It happened faster than that. Within 2 weeks, Clem and Harlan Fairchild were her two most enthusiastic students. Clem because he had indeed an extraordinary memory and loved being right, and Harlan because Etta had discovered immediately that the way to handle a boy who gave up when embarrassed was to never embarrass him, to find the approach that made him succeed first and build from there. And Harlan had bloomed under this method with the intensity of someone who had been waiting a long time for someone to figure him out. Orville Fairchild came to town on Fridays, which was when he collected supplies and settled accounts. Etta began to notice, with a precision she found slightly alarming in herself, that he always walked past the schoolhouse at approximately 3 in the afternoon, which was when the school day ended, and she was often standing in the doorway watching the children go home. He would nod to her. She would nod back. Sometimes he would stop and ask about the boys. These conversations were short and practical and charged with something she refused to name. One afternoon in early May, a situation arose that changed the shape of things. A rider came through Coulter's Creek with news that a band of rustlers had been working the ranches north of town, and Orville Fairchild was among the ranchers who had lost cattle. She heard about it from Mabel that evening, and she heard the rest of it the following morning when she arrived at school to find Clem and Harlan sitting on the steps with their lunch pails and their eyes red from crying. "What has happened?" she asked, sitting between them on the steps without hesitation. "Orville did not come home last night," Harlan said. "He went out with Mr. Decker and some others to track the rustlers, and he did not come back." Etta felt something cold move through her chest that she did not examine too closely. "Who is staying with you at the ranch?" "The hired man, Santos," Clem said, "but he does not know where Orville is either." She taught school that day with one part of her mind tracking the road north of town for any movement, which was not something she would have admitted to anyone. By noon, word came through that the riders had returned. The rustlers had been driven off. No one had been seriously hurt. Orville Fairchild had ridden back to his ranch without passing through town. She let out a breath that was embarrassingly long and shaky, and told herself it was simply the concern of a teacher for her student's guardian. She knew it was not that. It was on a Friday afternoon at the end of May that things shifted again. A storm had come in fast from the west, the kind of black wall of cloud that the territory produced with a sudden violence that still startled her. And she had been trying to get the remaining 3 students, whose families had not yet collected them, organized under shelter, when Orville Fairchild appeared in the doorway of the schoolhouse. He was wet already, his hat dark with rain, and he took in the situation in one look and simply began helping her move the small desks away from the leaking section of roof she had not yet managed to get repaired. He did not ask what needed to be done. He saw it and did it, and she found herself working beside him in the close noise of the storm with a sense of rightness that was so strong it was almost frightening. The parents came for the children one by one, and then it was only Etta and Orville in the small schoolhouse, with rain hammering the roof and lightning walking across the flats to the south. He looked around the room at the cracked window she had patched with oilcloth, at the sagging shelf she had propped with a stack of readers, at the drawing of the United States she had painted herself on the back wall. "This building needs work," he said. "I know that," she said. "I will fix the roof next week. And the window," she looked at him. "Mr. Fairchild, that is not your responsibility." "My brothers learn here," he said. "Makes it my responsibility," she could have argued. She did not, because she was practical enough to know the roof needed fixing and proud enough to have tried to fix it herself and honest enough to admit he would do it better. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Then he looked at her for a moment in a way that was different from the way he usually looked at her, which was to say he looked at her directly and without the practiced blankness, and she felt it like a hand pressing flat against her sternum. "You are doing good work here," he said. "The boys are better for it." It was, she would think later, probably the most emotionally generous thing he knew how to say, and he had given it to her quietly and without decoration, and she had accepted it with a simple thank you, and they had stood listening to the rain until it eased, and then he had held the door for her and walked her to Mabel's under the clear, washed evening sky. He had not touched her. He had not said anything further, but something had been decided between them, she felt, without either of them saying a word about it. He fixed the roof the following Tuesday with Santos's help, and did not accept her offer of payment or even of a meal, which frustrated her considerably. He was gone before she arrived at the schoolhouse in the morning, and the new shingles were there, and the window was fixed, and there was a new shelf installed where the sagging one had been, and she stood in the doorway of her repaired schoolroom, and felt warmly furious at him for being so thoroughly decent without allowing her to say anything about it. She made a pie. A proper apple pie with a crust that had taken her 3 attempts to get right. She sent it out with Clem and Harlan on Wednesday morning with a note that said simply, in appreciation, "E. Garrison." On Friday he came to town as usual and stopped at the schoolhouse doorway at 3 o'clock and said, "The pie was good." "I am glad," she said. "You can cook," he said, as though he was genuinely surprised. "You thought I could not." "You seem like someone with a great many things to do," he said, which was possibly the most oblique compliment she had ever received, and she found it utterly charming and was annoyed at herself for doing so. "Come inside," she said. "I have coffee on the stove." He came inside. He sat in the chair across from her desk, which was slightly too small for him, and wrapped his hands around the tin mug she gave him, and they talked. Not about the boys, not about the ranch or the school. They talked about things, about the territory, about where she had come from, about whether the railroad coming through in a few years would change Coulter's Creek for better or worse, about books she had read that he had too, because it emerged that Orville Fairchild read, quietly and privately and more widely than most people would have guessed, which delighted her. He left after an hour. When he stood up to go he paused at the door and said, "Same time next Friday." As though it were a practical arrangement, as though he were scheduling a fence repair. "Yes," she said, just as practically, and he nodded and left, and she sat at her desk for a full 5 minutes simply feeling the warmth of it before she made herself grade papers. This became their arrangement through June and into July. Every Friday at 3, coffee at the schoolhouse. The conversations grew longer. The things they discussed grew more personal, by degrees so gradual that she sometimes could not identify exactly when the line had moved. She knew his history by July. The father who had drunk away 2 years of cattle profits and died of it. The ranch that Orville had rebuilt from near ruin through 6 years of unrelenting work. The mother who had been a gentle woman worn thin by hardship and then gone. The 2 small brothers who were his whole family and his whole responsibility. She told him about Cincinnati, about her own parents who were schoolteachers both and had been kind and steady and entirely baffled by her decision to go west. About a sister named Clara who wrote letters full of news about people Etta was glad to be free of. About the reason she had truly come west, which was not just the salary, which was that she had been engaged once, briefly, to a man who had turned out to be something other than what he presented, and she had ended it, and the ending had cost her more socially than it had cost him, which was a specific injustice she had decided to refuse by simply leaving the entire geography of it behind. When she told him that last part, she watched his face carefully. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, he was a fool, with such flat, uncomplicated conviction that she felt it settle in her chest like something warm and solid. "Thank you," she said. "It is just true," he said, as though stating the weather. By August she was in love with him. She acknowledged this to herself with the same directness she applied to everything else, because she had found that refusing to acknowledge a thing did not make it less true. It just made you less prepared for the consequences. She was in love with Orville Fairchild, who was practical and quiet and stubbornly private and unexpectedly funny and completely, maddeningly terrible at expressing anything he felt about anything that mattered to him personally. She knew he felt something. She was not uncertain about that. She was a woman who paid close attention, and she had paid close attention to Orville Fairchild for 4 months, and she knew the way he looked at her was not the way a man looked at a pleasant acquaintance. She knew the way he lingered at the schoolhouse door before leaving was not a man with nowhere else to be. She knew that when she had been ill for a week in late July with a bad summer cold, the fact that fresh bread and a jar of Mabel's medicinal honey had appeared on her doorstep with a note in handwriting she recognized as his was not the act of a man with merely polite feelings. But he did not say it. He did not reach across the space between them. He sat across from her every Friday and looked at her with everything he felt written plainly in his dark eyes, and kept every word of it inside, and she began to understand that this was not simply shyness. It was pride, a deep, bone-level pride that had kept him upright through years of difficulty and had calcified around him like armor, and he did not know how to take it off, or perhaps he did not believe he should have to. She had spent considerable time deciding whether to say it herself, whether to simply tell him what she felt and offer him the grace of receiving it first. She was not herself, a woman with an excess of pride. She was direct and honest and practically inclined. But something in her resisted, not pride exactly, something more like the conviction that a man who could not offer this one thing, who could not be vulnerable enough to say first what was so clearly true, was a man who would never be truly reachable, no matter how close you stood to him. And so the fall came. September and October, the Friday conversations continued. Clem and Harlan flourished. The ranch did well in the autumn drives. Orville and Etta existed in this careful, electrically charged proximity, and nothing was said and nothing moved, and she began to feel the cost of it accumulating in her the way a debt accumulates, quietly, and then all at once. There was a harvest dance in October. The whole town attended, held in the cleared floor of the livery, with a fiddle player and a man on the squeeze box and lanterns strung overhead, and the particular golden warmth that autumn evenings in the territory produced. Orville came. She had not been certain he would. He arrived late, stood at the edge of the gathered people with his arms folded, and the expression of a man who was present out of duty rather than enthusiasm. And then his eyes found her across the room, and the expression changed. She was wearing a green dress she had brought from Cincinnati, the nicest thing she owned, because she had decided that she would dress for herself and not worry about what the practical women of Coulter's Creek would think. She saw his eyes take in the dress and then her face and stay there, and the particular quality of his attention was enough to make her feel warm from her collar to her heels. He crossed the room to her. He said, "You look well." "You look like a man who does not want to be at a dance," she said. Something moved in his face that might, in another man, have been a smile. "I did not say that." "You did not need to." He held out his hand. "Will you dance?" She looked at his hand and then at him. "Can you dance?" "Probably not well," he said, "but I can manage." He could not manage brilliantly. He was stiff and too conscious of his feet, and he held her at a careful, proper distance that she understood was enormous effort on his part and was accordingly both touching and frustrating. But he tried. He tried because she was there, and because he wanted to, and she could feel that wanting in the held tension of his hand at her waist, in the way he watched her face instead of his feet, even at the cost of stepping wrong twice. When the song ended, he did not immediately release her hand. He stood for a moment holding it, looking at her with that open, unguarded expression that she saw only occasionally, as though the armor slipped sometimes without his noticing. And she thought, "Say it, just say it. We are right here and you feel it and I feel it, and we are both standing here like fools for the sake of your pride." He did not say it. He released her hand and took a step back and said, I should check on the boys. Clem and Harlan were fine. They were eating cake with the minister's children and required no checking on. But she watched him go and felt something inside her go tight and cold, a small hardening of something she had been keeping soft. November came. The rains began. The Friday conversations continued, but something had shifted, some small thing had changed in her, and she was less warm, not cold exactly, but slightly more measured, slightly more careful with the warmth she offered, because she was beginning to protect herself from the accumulating cost of loving a man who could not say so. It was in November also that a complication arrived in the form of a man named Thomas Waxley, who came to Coulter's Creek to open a law practice. He was 30 years old and personable and educated and unambiguously interested in Etta Garrison, which he expressed directly and without any apparent complications of pride. He called on her at Mabel's. He brought her books from Santa Fe. He attended church on Sundays and sat near the schoolteacher's pew and smiled at her openly. She did not love Thomas Waxley, but she liked him, and he was kind, and he was present in a way that Orville was not, and she was a woman approaching 27 in a territory where single women had limited options, and she was not indifferent to the arithmetic of her situation. She told herself she was simply accepting a friend's company. She was not certain that was entirely true. What was true was that she wanted Orville to see it. She was ashamed of that want, because it was not her most dignified impulse, but it was there. The hope that the sight of someone else's direct, uncomplicated regard for her might finally move Orville Fairchild to say what he refused to say. It did move him, just not the way she hoped. On a Friday in early December, he arrived at the schoolhouse for their regular coffee at 3, and he was 20 minutes late, which had never happened before, and when he sat across from her the blankness was back, hard and complete. "I hear you have been spending time with the lawyer," he said. It was not what she expected. He was not asking. He was stating it like a fact he was presenting for the record, neutral, factual, which was the most infuriating possible way he could have addressed it. "I have had a few conversations with Mr. Waxley." "Yes," she said, matching his tone. "He has money," Orville said, "and a practice that will grow. He is the right sort for a woman like you." She looked at him across the table and felt the sting of it go deep. "The right sort," she repeated. "Settled, educated, he can offer things." "What things?" she asked quietly. He did not answer that. He moved his coffee mug in a small circle and looked at the table and said nothing, and she understood with devastating clarity what was happening. He was not being generous. He was not selflessly pointing her toward a better option. He was folding. He was taking the easy route, the one that required nothing of him, the one that cost him nothing, because to say the alternative would cost him everything, and Orville Fairchild did not pay that price. "I see," she said. The conversation ended shortly after. He left before 4 for the first time in months. She sat at her desk for a long time in the gray December light and let herself feel the full weight of it. Not the sharp pain of a quick ending, but the slow, grinding ache of watching something that could have been extraordinary simply refuse to become what it was. She saw Thomas Waxley twice more in December, and both times she was honest with herself and honest with him. At the end of the second visit, when he had begun to indicate that his intentions were serious, she told him that she valued his friendship and his company, but that her heart was not in a position to offer him what he deserved, and he had taken it with grace and a slightly pained smile, and they had parted on good terms. She told no one why her heart was in the position it was in. Not even Mabel, though Mabel clearly had her suspicions, expressed through the medium of particularly pointed observations at the breakfast table. Christmas came and went. The new year, 1883, arrived. She had been in Coulter's Creek for 9 months. January was cold and hard, and the roads were difficult, and Orville came to town less, which meant the Friday arrangement had broken down into something irregular and less reliable. And each time she saw him, she felt the distance she had begun to maintain between them like a physical thing, like a plank wall she was building one board at a time. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He was a man who paid attention, even when he could not say what he noticed or what it cost him. In February, a crisis at the ranch meant he was fully occupied for 3 weeks with a sick herd, a quarantine situation that Santos had managed brilliantly, and that Orville had overseen with his characteristic absolute focus. Harlan told her about it at school, proud of his brother in the way 11-year-olds are proud, openly and without reservation. Clem drew a picture of cattle with spots that was supposed to represent the sick ones and gave it to her, which she tacked to the wall next to the map of the United States. She did not ride out to the ranch to check on things, though she thought about it. She sent word through Harlan that she hoped the situation resolved well, which was a safe, appropriate teacher-to-guardian message that said nothing and everything. He came back to town in early March, and on the first Friday of March, he came to the schoolhouse at 3, and she was there, and she made coffee, and they sat across from each other, and it was different. Not different better. Different in the way that the space between them was now wide enough that both of them could feel it as a presence rather than an absence, wide enough that it had its own weight and temperature. "How are the cattle?" she asked. "Better. We lost 7, he said. Could have been worse." "I am sorry for the 7. It's ranching," he said. They talked. But she heard herself being careful, heard the warmth rationed, and she could see by the way he watched her that he heard it too, that he registered it in the way a man registers a shift in the weather. He left at 4 and stopped at the door as he always did with his hat in his hand, and he looked at her for a long moment with that same open, unguarded expression that she sometimes saw, the one that showed everything he would not say. "Etta," he said. She waited. Nothing came. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fairchild," she said, and turned back to her desk. She heard the door close behind him, and she pressed both hands flat on the surface of her desk and breathed. Spring came again. The 1-year mark passed. She had been in Coulter's Creek for a year, and she had lived alongside Orville Fairchild for a year, and she was tired. Not of him, never of him, but of the half-life of it, of loving someone at close range who could see everything and say nothing, of building a future in her own mind in which she always had to do all the architecture alone. April arrived. She began, quietly, to think about what it would mean to stay in Coulter's Creek for a 2nd year, and then a 3rd. She loved the school. She loved Clem and Harlan and the dozen other children in her care. She loved the country, the high, dry air and the impossible sunsets and the particular grandeur of the flats at dawn. She did not want to leave. But she was also a woman of 36-year-old resolve wearing down to something thinner, and she had a letter from her sister Clara in Cincinnati, who reported that the school where their mother had taught had an opening for a senior teacher, a position with real authority and real pay, and a life surrounded by people who already knew and loved her. She wrote back to Clara and said she was considering it. This was true. She was considering it with the particular kind of miserable consideration that happens when a person knows the right thing and the necessary thing are not the same thing. She did not tell Orville about the letter. There was no reason to tell him, except that there was every reason to tell him, if he was the man she believed he was, if they were what she believed they might have been. But since they were officially nothing to each other except the rancher and the schoolteacher who had Friday coffee, she said nothing. What she did not know, and would not know until much later, was what Orville Fairchild did in the evenings during that April. Santos, the hired man, was a quiet soul of 45 who had worked the Fairchild Ranch for 6 years, and who had, over those years, developed an accurate and somewhat compassionate understanding of his employer's most significant character flaw. Santos saw most of what happened at the Fairchild Ranch and said very little about any of it, which was a quality Orville valued enormously without recognizing that Santos was, in fact, observing him with considerable clarity. What Santos saw in April of 1883 was a man who sat on the porch after supper looking north, toward the direction of town, with an expression that Santos privately described to no one as the look of a man watching his own life walk away from him. Santos was also the one who told Orville in the first week of May that he had heard from the minister's wife, who had heard from Mabel Cortez that the schoolteacher had written to Cincinnati about a position there. Orville's face, Santos reported to no one, did something that Santos had never seen it do before. It went for a full 3 seconds completely open, not blank, open, the way a door flies back in a hard wind, and then it closed again. "Thank you for telling me," Orville said, and went inside. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time that night. Santos could see the lamp burning through the window when he crossed the yard to the bunkhouse at 10, and it was still burning at midnight when he rose to use the outhouse, and he shook his head and went back to bed. Orville sat at that table and did what he never allowed himself to do, which was think without the armor on. He thought about what it had cost him to say nothing over the past 14 months. He thought about the way her expression had become more careful. He thought about Thomas Waxley and the way he had managed that situation with a cowardice he had dressed up as generosity, and which he now understood she had seen through completely. He thought about the door closing behind him every Friday afternoon, the door of the schoolhouse, and the fact that he was on the wrong side of it, always on the wrong side of it, and he had put himself there. He thought about what he would do if she left. He thought about it for a very long time, and the answer that came back was so simple and so terrible that it sat in him like a stone. He would let her go. He would watch her pack and leave, and he would let her go because the alternative was to say something that would leave him entirely exposed, entirely without the distance he had maintained his whole adult life, entirely at the mercy of another person's answer, and that was the one thing Orville Fairchild could not do, or so he believed. He went to bed at 2 in the morning having made no decision at all, which was itself the decision, and he knew it. The days passed. May deepened. She continued teaching. He continued ranching. On Fridays he came to town. The coffees continued, shorter now, less easy, full of the silences she no longer worked to fill, and which he noticed with an internal ache he refused to examine. On the second Friday in May, she told him that the minister had asked her to lead a special school presentation for the town's Founding Day celebration the following week, and she was planning it with the children, and her eyes were bright with the pleasure of it, that particular brightness that came when she was engaged in something she loved, and he watched her talk about it and felt something in his chest like a physical pressure. "The children will do very well," he said. "You make them confident." She looked at him, and for a moment the careful distance dropped, and he saw her as she really was with him, warm and wanting and tired of waiting, and it was the most honest thing he had seen in months. "Thank you, Orville," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name in weeks. He almost said it then. It was in his throat. It was a word away from being spoken. And the armor went up fast and automatic, and he said, "Same time next week," and picked up his hat and left. 2 days later, she received a formal letter from the school board in Cincinnati. They were offering her the senior teacher position, effective September of 1883. The salary was significantly better than what Coulter's Creek provided. The letter was polite and urgent and represented, she knew, a genuinely good opportunity. She read it at the kitchen table in Mabel's boarding house while Mabel made supper and tried to pretend she was not watching Etta's face. "Well," Mabel said finally. "Well," Etta said. "You are not going to tell him," Mabel said. "It was not a question." "I have told him nothing that warrants a response for 14 months, Etta said. "What would be the point of telling him now?" Mabel put down her wooden spoon and turned from the stove and looked at her with the expression of a woman who had watched a great many human situations resolve and unresolve themselves and had opinions. "The point would be to give him the opportunity to say what he has not yet said. If he needs the threat of my departure to say it," Etta said carefully, "then I do not want it." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is very noble. It is also going to leave you alone and in Cincinnati." Etta looked at the letter. "Perhaps that is the right outcome." She did not believe that. But she said it, and she folded the letter, and she began to think about what staying in Coulter's Creek had cost her in the weight of a feeling that had nowhere to go. She replied to the Cincinnati School Board the following Monday and said she would give them her decision by the 1st of June. She did not tell Orville, but Mabel told Santos, because Mabel and Santos had a friendship of long standing built on the mutual appreciation of directness, and Santos told Orville on a Wednesday evening in the third week of May. "She has until the 1st of June to decide," Santos said, with the air of a man delivering a weather report that concerned a particularly important piece of infrastructure. Orville was cleaning a rifle at the kitchen table. He set it down. "When did you hear this?" he said. "Today." Orville picked up the rifle again. "All right." Santos looked at him for a moment. "I told you because I thought you would want to know. I heard you. The 1st of June is 11 days away." "I can count," Orville said. Santos went to bed. Orville sat at the table with the rifle for a long time. 9 days passed. 9 days in which Etta Garrison went about her work, and her life with the quiet, determined composure of a woman who had made a decision she had not yet officially made, who was prepared to do the hard thing, who was packing up her life in her mind, even as she stood at the chalkboard teaching long division to 10 children who looked at her with uncomplicated trust. She wrote to Clara that she expected to accept the position. Clara wrote back with undisguised delight and began describing the rooms available near the school and the social engagements that awaited. Etta read the letter and felt nothing particularly warm about any of it, which told her something she needed to know. On the evening of the 29th of May, 2 days before the decision was due, she sat in her room at Mabel's boarding house and took out the leather satchel she had brought from Cincinnati. It was a good satchel, brown leather, brass clasps, initialed EG in small letters near the handle. She set it on the bed and looked at it. She thought about what she was doing. She thought about it with complete honesty because she owed herself that. She was packing this bag not because she wanted to go to Cincinnati, but because she had loved a man who was too proud to say so, and she did not know how long a person could sustain a love like that without it becoming something painful and diminishing. She was packing this bag because the alternative was to stay in Coulter's Creek and watch another year pass and another year after that, always close to something that refused to become real, and she was 36 months past willing to do that. She was not packing the bag to manipulate him. She would be going whether he said anything or not, because she had decided that. But she would be going on the 1st of June, and it was the 29th now, and she would spend the next 2 days doing it properly, packing her books and her clothes and her things with the care of a woman who was leaving a place she had come to love. She began with the books. The next morning was the 30th of May. She taught school. The children were working on their reading. Outside, the last spring wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek bed, and the sky was the particular deep blue that the New Mexico territory produced like a specialty, and she stood in the doorway of her school during the midday break and breathed it in with the conscious deliberateness of someone making a memory. Harlan came to stand beside her. He was 12 now, nearly 13, and he had grown serious in the way that bright children groan, by turning everything into a question. "Miss Garrison," he said, "are you really going to Cincinnati?" She looked at him. "Where did you hear that?" "Santos told Orville, and Orville told us not to worry about it, but that means it is true," Harlan said, with the logic she had herself identified as his great strength. She was quiet for a moment. "I am considering it," she said carefully. "But you like it here," Harlan said. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of evidence presented plainly. "I do like it here," she said, "very much." "Then why would you go?" "Because some reasons do not belong in a conversation with a 12-year-old, she thought. "Sometimes the right thing and the easy thing are not the same," she said. Harlan considered this with the serious concentration he brought to everything. "Orville says that a lot," he said, "about ranching things." "It applies to most things," she said. Harlan went back inside. She stood in the doorway a moment longer. That afternoon she finished packing the smaller items, the personal things, the letters from Clara and her parents, the small framed print of a garden she had carried from Cincinnati because it reminded her of her mother's porch. She left the books for last because books were heavy and she had a great many of them, and also because packing the books meant it was truly decided, and she was leaving the truly decided for the morning. It was the 30th of May. The lamp was burning at Mabel's. Etta was in her room with the mostly packed satchel on the floor beside her bed and a cup of tea going cold on the bedside table. There was a knock at the front door downstairs. She heard Mabel's footsteps, heard the door open, heard a voice she knew so well it lived in the back of her chest like a second heartbeat. She sat perfectly still. She heard Mabel say something. She heard Orville's voice again, lower, and then the sound of footsteps on the stairs and then a knock at her door. She stood. She smoothed the front of her dress. She opened the door. He was standing in the narrow hallway in his good shirt, the one he wore to town on Fridays, and he had combed his hair, and he had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly in a circle by the brim, which was the only indication she had ever found in him of genuine nerves, that slow turning of the hat brim. He looked at her. Then he looked past her at the satchel on the floor, the packed satchel, the brass clasps done up and the leather strap buckled, and something moved through his face. "You are going," he said. "I am considering it," she said, which was no longer entirely true, but she said it. "May I come in?" Mabel would be listening from the bottom of the stairs, but Mabel was a woman of genuine discretion who would take her listening and her knowing and keep it in a private place. So Etta stepped back and he came into the room, and she left the door open because she was not naive about appearances in a small town. He stood in the middle of her small room and looked around it with those dark eyes, and she could see him taking in the evidence of her packing, the cleared shelf where the framed print had been, the missing books that had lined the windowsill. "Santos told me," he said. "I thought he might," she said. He turned the hat in his hands. "The 1st of June." "Yes." "That is the day after tomorrow." "Yes." He looked at her. The hat stopped turning. He stood with it still in his hands, and he looked at her with the armor completely down, with everything in his face that she had been watching for 14 months, everything she had felt there behind the blankness and the deflection and the cowardice dressed as pride, all of it visible now, and it was, God help her, everything she had thought it was. It was enormous. It was the kind of feeling that took up a room. "I have something to say to you," he said. "Then say it," she said very quietly. He breathed in. He breathed out, and he said it. He said all of it. Not in the eloquent, polished language of a man practiced at speaking his heart, because he was not that man, and she did not want that man. In the plain, unvarnished, halting language of a man who was doing the hardest thing he had ever done. "I have loved you since May of last year," he said. "Since the coffee in the schoolhouse. Since the first time we talked properly, and I rode home thinking about you for 3 hours straight, and could not get a single useful thought through my head. I have loved you, and I have been too proud to say it, and too afraid of what it would mean if I said it, and you did not want it back. Or if you did want it back. Because wanting it back means my whole life changes, and the last time I let my whole life depend on something that could leave, it left. And I nearly lost the ranch and the boys and everything with it. And I know that is not your fault, and I know it is not a good reason to be a coward, and I have been a coward with you, and I know it. I know what I have done." He stopped. The hat was still in his hands. His knuckles were white on the brim. "I am telling you now because you are about to leave, and I cannot watch you leave without telling you the truth. If you go knowing that I love you and that I am sorry I made you wait so long for me to say it. And if you stay," he stopped again, started again. "If you stay, I would like very much to court you properly, to do it right, to say things when they need to be said," a pause that cost him something visible. "I am not good at this. I think you know that, but I would try. I would try because you are worth trying for, and because I have never in my life wanted anything the way I want to stop being the man who let you pack your bag and leave." The room was very quiet. Etta looked at him for a long moment, at this man she had loved and been frustrated by and almost left, and she felt the warmth she had been rationing for months rise up in her all at once, uncontained. "You should have told me in August," she said, "when I first knew." "I know," he said. "You let 14 months go by. I know. You suggested I was better suited to a lawyer." His jaw tight. "I know that. That was wrong of me." "It was," she said. It was exactly wrong. Yes, he said. He looked at her steadily. He did not flinch from the accounting. She crossed the room to him. She stood 2 feet away and looked up at him and saw everything in his face. The love and the fear and the pride cracked open at last. And she said, "I have loved you since August, Orville. Since the conversation about books and whether the railroad would change things. I have loved you completely, and I have been waiting for you to say it, and every week that you did not say it cost me something I cannot fully name." His breath came out in something that was almost a sound. "I know," he said again, and this time it was different, full of the understanding of exactly what that cost had been, and she believed he understood it. "If I stay," she said carefully, "and you court me properly and something comes of it, you cannot ever do that again. You cannot go silent when the important things need to be said. I will not live in that silence." "I know," he said, "I will not. I need you to mean that. Etta." He said her name, just her name, and this time it was not a deflection. It was an offering. "I mean everything I have said in this room tonight. I am not a man who says things he does not mean. I am a man who does not say things he should. That is the truth of what I am. But I am standing here telling you I will learn the difference, and I will say the things that matter because not saying them has cost me you nearly, and I cannot afford that." She looked at him for another moment. She looked at the hat still in his hands, the white-knuckled grip, the truth of what this had cost him to do, because she had paid enough attention to know exactly how much it had cost him. "Put your hat down," she said. He looked at her. "Put your hat down, Orville." He set the hat on the edge of her dresser. She reached out and took his hand, both of his hands, and held them, and felt the tension in them and did not let go. "I am not going to Cincinnati," she said. "I was going because I could not see another way, but this is another way, and I am staying." The change in his face was the most remarkable thing she had ever watched happen to another person's expression. It was like watching a wall fall in a controlled way, the way Santos might bring down an old fence post, with intention, with the knowledge that what was on the other side had been waiting. He pressed her hands and bent his head and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that in the lamplight of her small room at Mabel's boarding house, with the packed satchel on the floor, and the evidence of leaving all around them, and she felt his whole body exhale. "Thank you," he said very quietly. "Do not make me regret it," she said, which was not a threat but a truth, and he nodded against her forehead and said, "I will do everything I can to make sure you do not." In the morning she unpacked the satchel. Mabel made coffee with the expression of a woman who had heard everything from the bottom of the stairs and was entirely satisfied with the outcome. The courtship that followed was, by the standards of Coulter's Creek in 1883, both proper and unmistakable. Orville called on her at Mabel's on Sunday afternoons after church. He brought her things, not flowers, which was not his natural idiom, but things. A copy of a novel she had mentioned wanting, a particularly fine piece of turquoise he had traded for at the trading post because the color was the same as the brooch her mother had given her, a jar of something Santos had made from late summer peaches that was so good she went through it in 4 days. He sat with her on Mabel's porch on Sunday evenings and he talked, not about logistics. He talked to her. He talked about the things that mattered, about the land and his plans for the ranch, about Clem's future and Harlan's, about the kind of life he was building. He told her about his father, the full story, the parts he had never told anyone. She listened and did not offer more comfort than he asked for, which was the right amount. He said things. Not perfectly, not with the ease of a man practiced at the art of it, but with the effort of someone who had made a genuine decision and was honoring it. She saw the effort and loved him more for it, because it was real. She told him things too, the full version of the story she had given him in edited installments, about the engagement in Cincinnati and what it had cost her, about the ways she had rebuilt her confidence after it, about what it had meant to come west and make something that was entirely hers. He listened with the quality of attention she had first noticed on the rooftop of the barn, focused and complete. In August, 1 year after she had known she loved him, he asked her to marry him. He did not do it dramatically. He did not do it on one knee with speeches. They were sitting on a blanket at the edge of the creek in the long golden light of a late summer evening, having ridden out from town together after supper with Harlan and Clem trailing behind them, and then, by mutual adolescent agreement, finding reasons to be somewhere further upstream. He said, "I want to marry you, Etta. I want you to come to the ranch and make it a home the way it has not been since my mother was alive. I want to raise the boys with you and have more children with you if we are lucky enough, and I want to spend however many years I get telling you the things that matter." A pause. "I am asking you to marry me, if you will." She looked at the creek for a moment, at the water moving over the smooth stones, catching the last of the light. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Orville." He turned to look at her and smiled. A full, real smile. The kind she had seen so rarely and loved so completely. And she reached over and took his hand, and they sat like that until Clem came crashing back through the cottonwoods demanding to know if supper had been decided. And Orville said in a voice that was entirely composed, "Go find your brother, Clem. We will be along shortly." And Clem retreated. And Etta laughed quietly, and Orville's hand tightened on hers. They were married in October of 1883 by the minister of Coulter's Creek in the church on the main street, with the whole town attending because in a small town the whole town always attended. Mabel Cortez stood with Etta. Santos stood with Orville, impassive and deeply pleased. Clem and Harlan sat in the front pew and were almost unbearably proud. Harlan with the serious dignity of someone attending an important event. Clem with barely contained excitement that expressed itself in periodic small bouncing movements. Etta wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Orville had brought back from Santa Fe, a blue-gray wool that she had chosen because it was practical and beautiful at once, which seemed right. She carried no flowers because it was October and flowers were sparse, but Mabel had found a few late-season wild asters and tucked them into her hair, and they were exactly the right small impractical touch. Orville, standing at the front of the church when she walked in, looked at her the way he had looked at her in the green dress at the harvest dance the previous year, with the same full, unguarded attention, except that this time he did not look away and he did not fold, and she saw in his face as she walked toward him a happiness so complete it had nowhere to hide. The minister asked the words and they said them. And when he said Orville might kiss his bride, Orville cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with a gentleness that was at odds with the strength of his hands. And Clem made a sound of theatrical disgust, and Harlan told him to be quiet, and the town of Coulter's Creek laughed. She moved to the ranch in October. This involved considerably more logistics than romance, the moving of her books in particular, which now numbered enough to require a dedicated shelf that Orville built in the front room and which he stained to match the mantel. She stood back and looked at it when it was done, her books in place, and thought that this was what it looked like when a person's life combined with another person's life. Shelves added, books arranged, space made. The first winter at the ranch was hard in the way that ranch winters were hard, cold and physically demanding, and full of the small emergencies that livestock produced regardless of the season. She was not a woman who had grown up on a ranch, but she was a woman who learned quickly and who did not shy from the physical reality of things. And by January, she had a functional understanding of what needed doing and when, and Orville watched her adapt with an admiration he expressed in the direct, practical way she had come to understand was his primary love language. He bought her proper boots from the best bootmaker in Santa Fe, because the ones she had were not warm enough for the work she was doing. She told him she loved him in December, standing at the kitchen stove, stirring a pot of stew while he came in from the evening chores with cold air on his coat and stopped behind her and kissed the back of her neck. "I love you," she said, stirring, as though it were simply a fact of the kitchen like the temperature of the stove. He turned her around gently and said it back, not as though it were a fact of the kitchen but as though it were a fact of the world, something fixed and reliable as the land itself. I love you, Etta. I love you without any reservation. She looked at him. That was well said. I am practicing, he said. And she laughed and he smiled and she reached up and pressed her hand flat against his chest and felt his heartbeat under her palm, steady and real and entirely hers. That spring, 1884, Harlan was accepted to the preparatory school in Albuquerque that the minister had recommended, a real achievement that Etta had helped prepare him for, drilling him on his examinations with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Orville rode with him to Albuquerque and saw him settled, and came back quieter than usual, which was saying something. She let him be quiet for a day and then sat beside him on the porch and said, "He will be remarkable." You gave him the foundation. Orville looked at the middle distance. He looked very small in that city. He will grow into it, she said. He is Harlan. After a moment he said, he told me before I left that he wants to be a lawyer. A pause. He said you told him once that the right thing and the easy thing are not the same. She was quiet. He said it stuck with him, Orville said. Said it was the most useful thing anyone ever told him. She pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment, then removed it. He will be a very good lawyer, she said. He will, Orville agreed, and reached over and took her hand, and they sat on the porch in the spring evening with the land going golden ahead of them. Clem, meanwhile, was thriving at her school and had developed a special interest in plants, in the territory's particular ecology, that she nurtured because it was clearly his true passion, and because the territory's plants were genuinely remarkable and deserved a person like Clem who would remember every detail about them. He spent his free hours with Santos, learning from the older man's deep knowledge of the native plants and the ways they had been used for generations, knowledge Santos held with the care of a person who understood its value. In June of 1884, Etta discovered she was expecting a child. She told Orville on a Tuesday evening when Clem was in bed and the house was quiet, sitting across the kitchen table from him the way they sometimes sat after supper talking about things, the way that had begun in the schoolhouse and had never really ended, just moved to a different table. She told him plainly. She was good at plain. He sat very still for a moment. Then he reached across the table and took her hand and held it in both of his with a grip that was careful and very firm, and he said, "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "I am very well." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she knew now, the unguarded one, and she saw in it all the complicated things that a man of his history would feel at this news, the joy and the weight of it, the fear and the hope, and underneath all of it a love so comprehensive it needed both hands and a steady grip to hold. "We will need to tell Mabel," he said. "Yes," she said. "She will be insufferably pleased with herself." "She will deserve to be," he said. In February of 1885, under the care of the local midwife and Mabel Cortez, who attended as a matter of personal authority rather than invitation, Etta gave birth to a boy. They named him Joseph, after Orville's father, which was Orville's suggestion and which surprised her, given the difficult history, until he explained. "He was not a good father, but he was my father, and this boy will be a good man, and I would like the name to have a different meaning." Joseph Fairchild arrived in the world at 4 in the morning with a robust opinion about it, expressed at volume. Orville held him with the careful, slightly awed concentration of someone handling something both precious and entirely new to him, which he was, and Etta, exhausted and incandescent, watched her husband hold their son and felt something she had no adequate word for. "He looks angry," Orville said. "He will calm down," she said. "He looks like you," Orville said. "He looks like a baby," she said. "Give him time." Orville looked up at her over the baby's head with a smile that she had been collecting for 2 years now, the real ones, the ones she had been among the first people in his adult life to see regularly. "Thank you," he said, "for him, for all of it." "Thank me in 6 weeks when I am sleeping again," she said, and he laughed quietly and looked back at Joseph, who was already, in his arms, going quieter. Santos, when presented with Joseph the following morning, said good. In Santos' terms, this was practically a speech. Mabel, who had already been there for the birth and had made coffee and held Etta's hand for 2 hours at the hardest part and had shown absolutely no inclination to leave, looked at the baby and at Orville and at Etta and said with great satisfaction, "Good. Now you have done the thing properly." "Which thing?" Orville asked. "All of it," Mabel said. Life at the Fairchild Ranch in 1885 was full in the way that life becomes full when it is working right, when all the pieces are in their true places, and the whole of it has a weight and a texture that a half-life never achieves. Etta had given up the school in Coulter's Creek when she moved to the ranch, but she had not given up teaching, because within 6 months of the marriage she was teaching the ranch children of 3 neighboring families who were too far from town for the school to reach. And this arrangement had grown and formalized, and she had established a small schoolroom in an outbuilding on the Fairchild property that Orville had fixed and fitted with proper windows and 2 rows of desks. She was 29 years old and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. And the knowledge of that was so clean and solid that she sometimes stood in the doorway of the schoolroom at the end of a teaching day and simply felt it, like warmth from a stove. In the spring of 1886, Harlan came home from Albuquerque for the summer with a confidence that had not been there before, a settled certainty about the path ahead of him that made him look older. He spent hours talking with Etta about the law and about justice, and about the particular injustices of the territory, the way land was taken from native peoples, the way Mexican families who had held land for generations were being pressured off it by Anglo newcomers with legal machinery designed to dispossess them. He was angry about these things in the principled way of a young man who is deciding what he stands for, and she encouraged the anger and the thinking both. And Orville listened to these conversations from the other side of the kitchen, with the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something he built become something that would outlast him. On one such evening Harlan said to Orville, "Did you know that Santos's family had land once, up near Taos?" Orville looked at him. "No. He told me 40 acres, his grandfather's. They lost it in the land disputes in the 1870s. He does not talk about it." Orville was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I did not know." He looked at Etta. She looked back at him and she could see him processing this, the discomfort of it, the reckoning it required. The following week, Orville had a long conversation with Santos that neither of them reported in detail. What changed after that conversation was that Santos was given a formal share in the operation of the ranch, a written agreement drawn up with the help of the lawyer from Santa Fe, which gave him an income and a stake that was real and permanent and could not be taken back. Orville told Etta about it the evening after the papers were signed, plainly and without ceremony. She looked at him for a moment. "That was the right thing," she said. "It was the appropriate thing," he said. "It was long overdue." "Yes," she said, "but you did it." He nodded, and she saw in his face that he was sitting with the discomfort of having not seen it sooner, not flinching from it but not dismissing it either, and she loved him for the honesty of the sitting with it. Santos, when she thanked him for being patient with all of them, looked at her with a dry expression and said, "You are the reason he finally asked. You made him look at things." She had not known whether to be flattered or embarrassed and had settled on grateful. Clem turned 15 in 1887 and had by that point developed such a comprehensive knowledge of the territory's plant life that a professor from the university in Las Cruces, passing through Coulter's Creek on a survey, had spent 2 hours talking with him and gone away visibly impressed and with a standing invitation for Clem to correspond. Etta helped him with the correspondence, the formality of letters, the presentation of what he knew in writing, because Clem's knowledge was real and vast, but his instinct was to speak rather than write, and writing was a skill that required cultivation. Joseph, at 2 years old, had developed a personality that was recognizable to anyone who had spent time with his parents. The directness and the analytical patience of his mother combined with the quiet stubbornness and the sudden unexpected humor of his father. He was a sturdy, serious, curious child who rarely cried and always watched, and had a particular attachment to Santos that expressed itself in following the older man around the ranch at a short distance like a purposeful small shadow. The second child arrived in the autumn of 1887. A girl this time, born in September, whom they named Rosa after Orville's mother, whose middle name it had been, and whose own mother had been from a family of Spanish settlers 2 generations back. Rosa Fairchild was born with her mother's auburn coloring and her father's dark eyes, and a quantity of personal will that became apparent almost immediately. Orville holding Rosa on the evening of her birth, with Joseph sitting beside him on the bed looking at her with the solemn assessment of a 2-year-old evaluating a new situation, said, "She is going to be a great deal of trouble." "She is going to be wonderful," Etta said. "Both," he said. "Both," she agreed. With 2 children and the ranch school and the ongoing operations of the Fairchild spread, life was full to its edges, and the fullness was of the kind that exhausts and nourishes simultaneously. Etta was 31 and healthy and busy in every moment, and she loved the busyness the way she loved the work, not because it was easy but because it was hers, fully and completely hers, chosen and built and real. Orville in his mid-30s was a different man than the one she had first seen on a rooftop nailing shingles. Not different in kind. The bedrock of him was the same, the steadiness, the practicality, the deep quiet care for the people who were his. But the armor was different now, worn differently, less like a wall and more like a coat that he could take off when he came inside. He talked to her. He said the things. Not always perfectly, not always promptly, but he said them, and she had learned to trust that he would. There were still moments when she could see him pulling back, see the old reflex of silence rising up, and she had learned to call them by their name without drama, simply and directly. "You are going quiet on something important," she would say. And he would look at her with the look of a man caught doing something he had promised to work on, and he would say whatever it was. The trust that built between them was the kind that does not arrive quickly and cannot be replicated. It was built in moments, in honesty offered and received, in the daily practice of showing up for each other with the full version of themselves. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was in the process of moving toward statehood, though the actual statehood would not come for years more. The conversations in Coulter's Creek about the future of the territory were constant and sometimes heated. About land rights, about water rights, about the treatment of the Pueblo peoples, whose relationship to the land predated every other claim by centuries. Etta brought these conversations into her school, not as polemic but as reality, as history, as the actual geography of the place where her students lived and which they would inherit. Orville, who had initially approached these matters with a practical rancher's pragmatism, had, under the combined influence of Etta's principled directness and Harlan's fiery idealism in his letters home, developed a more considered position on the responsibilities of those who held land in the territory. He became, in his quiet, thorough way, someone who voted and spoke and organized against the more egregious land grabs that were being perpetrated against the territory's Spanish and native communities, and who used his standing as one of the more successful ranchers in the area to give weight to positions that would not otherwise have been heard from someone of his standing. He did this without fanfare. He would have found fanfare excruciating, but he did it. Harlan came home at Christmas of 1889 with his law degree formally completed and a position accepted in Santa Fe, and spent the holiday telling them about his plans with a fervor that filled the house. Joseph, who was 5, followed Harlan everywhere with the specific adoration that small children reserve for the most exciting version of an older sibling. Rosa, too, was entirely unimpressed by the commotion, and spent Christmas investigating the lower shelves of the bookcase with methodical seriousness. On Christmas Eve, after the children were in bed and Santos had retired and Clem was reading in his room, and Harlan was writing letters at the kitchen table, Orville and Etta sat together by the fire in the front room with the tree that Clem had cut and decorated standing in the corner, and the house quiet around them. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat in the firelight, and she felt the whole of the life they had built and were still building, felt it around them like the walls of the house itself, solid and warm and entirely real. "I think about October of 1882 sometimes," he said. "Which part?" she asked. "The dance, when I held your hand and did not say anything." She was quiet for a moment. "I think about it too. I am sorry it took me as long as it did," he said. "I know I have said that before, but I am still sorry." She turned to look at him. "We got here," she said. "We did. And you said it when it mattered most, when it was hardest. That is the one that counts." He looked at her with the expression she had been collecting for 7 years, the unguarded, full, complete one. "It was the most terrifying thing I have ever done," he said. "More terrifying than the rustlers, more terrifying than the sick herd, considerably more terrifying than the roof." "I know," she said. "I know exactly how much it cost you. That is why I stayed." He pressed his lips to her temple. "I am glad you stayed. I am glad you finally spoke," she said. They sat by the fire until it burned low, and then they went to bed in the house that was theirs, in the life that was theirs, and the territory lay quiet and vast and deep-starred around them. In 1890, Clem left for Las Cruces to study with the professor who had been corresponding with him for 3 years. He was 18, technically, when he left, and the goodbyes were long and involved a great many practical instructions from Orville about money management, and a great deal of absolutely non-practical emotional expression from Etta, who held him for a long time, and told him he was going to do extraordinary things. Clem, who had grown from a 9-year-old with a perfect memory into a young man with a genuine vocation and a good heart, looked at her with those clear eyes and said, "You made me believe I could." She held on for another moment. "You always could. I just helped you see it." Santos watched Clem ride out with the expression of a man watching something he had been part of growing go out into the world, which it was, and then turned back to his work, which was what Santos did. Joseph at 5 was already showing an aptitude for the land that made Orville's eyes soften in a particular way. He was endlessly curious about how things worked, how the cattle were managed, how the water was directed, how the land itself functioned across seasons. He rode with his father from the age of 4, perched in the saddle with a seriousness that was comic in its smallness and touching in its sincerity. Etta taught him his letters and numbers with the rigor she brought to all her students, and the particular warmth she reserved for this one. And he was a diligent student who applied to schoolwork the same patient attention he applied to watching how his father moved through the land. Rosa was learning to read with the focused intensity of someone who has decided to conquer a thing completely. She had her father's characteristic approach to new challenges, quiet assessment, and then total commitment. She sat at the kitchen table with Etta every evening and worked through her readers with a determination that was almost fierce, and Etta watched her and thought, not for the first time, that this daughter was going to be a force. By 1892, the Fairchild Ranch had expanded by the purchase of an additional 30 acres to the east, a purchase made possible by a particularly good cattle year and Orville's careful financial management over the preceding decade. The new land had a better water source, and Orville's plan for it was long-term, the kind of planning that looked out 20 years, that built something for the generation to come. He showed her the plan one evening, spread on the kitchen table, drawn in his precise hand, the kind of plan that was itself a kind of love letter to the land and to the future. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. "You are building this for them," she said. "For all of us," he said. "But yes, for them." She thought of the man on the rooftop who had told her to come back in an hour, who had sat across from her in his too-orderly kitchen and talked about his brothers with the precision of someone who had been paying very close attention. She thought of how much of him had always been this, the careful builder, the long-term planner, the man who loved by doing and making and staying. "You were always going to be a good father," she said. He looked slightly startled by this, as though the idea of it was new. "I did not know that," he said. "I did," she said. "I saw it in the first conversation we ever had, The way you talked about Clem and Harlan." He looked at the plan on the table and then at her. "You saw a great deal in the first conversation." "I paid attention," she said. "You were worth paying attention to." He folded the plan carefully. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited because even now, even after 9 years of this, there was still the automatic quality of her attention when he said those words, the particular alertness of a woman who had learned to take seriously every time this particular man decided to speak. "I have been happy," he said. "I want you to know that. I know I do not always say the things I should when I should, but I have been happy every day since the day you stayed, and I want you to know that completely." She looked at him for a moment. "Say it again," she said. He smiled, that full, real smile. "I have been happy every day." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "As have I," she said. "Every single one." In the summer of 1893, Etta discovered she was expecting again. She was 37 years old, which was not young for a third child, and she and Orville were both aware of the additional considerations. But she was healthy, and the midwife was encouraging, and Orville spent the pregnancy being comprehensively, almost urgently attentive in ways that were sometimes useful and sometimes the opposite of useful, and which she received with equal parts appreciation and good-humored direction. A second son arrived in March of 1894. They named him Daniel because it was strong and simple, and because Etta's father, who had died 2 years before, had carried it as a middle name. Daniel Fairchild came into the world with the same vocal announcement that Joseph had made, and with a head of dark hair that was entirely his father's, and he was from the first a social and energetic child in contrast to his older siblings, who were both more inward, and the house took on a new texture of noise and movement with him in it. Joseph, 9 years old, looked at Daniel with the solemn responsibility of a firstborn and announced that he would teach him everything he knew. Rosa, 6, was more immediately practical and began planning what she called Daniel's education as though it were a building project, which charmed Etta to the point of tears she hid in the kitchen. Orville held Daniel the first night the way he had held Joseph and Rosa, with that same careful, awed attention, and said, "3," as though he was counting a kind of wealth. "3," Etta agreed. He looked at her with everything in his face. "Thank you," he said, for the third time in this specific context, and she said, as she had both times before, "Thank me in 6 weeks when I am sleeping again." And he laughed quietly, and she loved him entirely and without reservation. Mabel came for 3 weeks to help, and was, as ever, indispensable and insufferable in equal measure, and Santos was by this point so integrated into the life of the ranch and the family that his quiet pleasure at the arrival of the third child was simply another strand of the family's happiness. By 1896, Harlan was practicing law in Santa Fe and had married a woman named Elena Vega, who was bright and warm and who Etta liked immediately and completely. They visited the ranch in summer, and the house filled up with conversation and the particular energy of people who are deeply engaged with the world and each other. Harlan, in his law practice, was doing the work he had always intended, working on cases involving land rights and the legal protections of communities who had been systematically disadvantaged, and he was good at it and relentless about it, and Elena was fiercely proud of him. Clem, from Las Cruces, sent regular letters full of botanical Latin and detailed descriptions of plant specimens, and the occasional story about the university world that managed to be both funny and bewildering. He had become a genuine scientist, the professor had told Orville in a letter, the kind who comes along rarely and should be encouraged fully, and Orville had read that letter twice and then folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept important papers. Joseph at 11 was his father's apprentice on the ranch in every meaningful sense, learning the work with the patience and attention of someone who intended to do it for the rest of his life and wanted to do it right. Rosa at 8 was her mother's student with a particular ferocity and had declared her intention to become a teacher, which she said with the same definitive certainty with which her father said things he had already fully decided, and which Etta recognized immediately and entirely. Daniel at 2 was making everyone's life more interesting and more exhausting in approximately equal measure, and was universally adored. On a Friday evening in October of 1896, 14 years after the dance at the Livery where Orville Fairchild had held Etta Garrison's hand and not said the thing he felt, they sat together on the porch of the ranch house in the last of the autumn light, which was gold and long and achingly beautiful, the way only New Mexico autumn light could be, with the sound of the children inside, and Santos crossing the yard below, and the land spread out ahead of them going to the horizon. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had so many times, the way that never stopped being exactly the right gesture at the right moment, because Orville had learned, in the years since the night he stood in her room at Mabel's and finally spoke, that the things that matter most are the small, consistent ones, the hand taken, the name said with intention, the turning toward rather than away. "Etta," he said. "Yes," she said. "I love you," he said, not as a confession, not as an unburdening. As a fact of the world, offered in the evening light, steady and certain. "I love you," she said back, the same way. Steady and certain and entirely without reservation. The land lay golden ahead of them. The house was warm behind them. Their children's voices were the sound of the life they had built, and it was real and it was whole and it was theirs completely. He had been too proud to say it first once. She had packed her bag, and he had finally spoken, and the words had reached her across the space of pride and silence, and she had stayed, and everything that had followed had been the consequence of that one true thing said at last. The autumn evening deepened. The stars came out over the New Mexico territory one by one, as they had every night for longer than any of them could count, brilliant and indifferent and gorgeous. The lamp in the window of the ranch house made a warm square of light in the gathering dark, a small human warmth against the vast and beautiful country that surrounded it. Inside, Joseph was reading to Daniel from the primer that Etta had used in her first schoolroom in Coulter's Creek, the one she had kept because some things you do not leave behind. Rosa was at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and a very serious expression, drawing or perhaps planning. It was sometimes difficult to tell the difference with Rosa. Santos had finished his evening rounds and gone to his quarters, content in the way a man is content when he is in the right place. On the porch, Orville and Etta sat together and held hands and watched the dark come softly over the land, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more, because everything that needed to be said had been said, was being said, in the warm pressure of held hands and the shared quiet of a life built honestly and well. Everything was resolved. Everything was whole. Everything was exactly as it should be. The stars over Coulter's Creek turned in their ancient courses, and the lamp burned steady in the window of the Fairchild ranch house, and the night was clear and cold, and full of the particular peace that comes to people who have done the hard thing, and found on the other side of it something worth all the cost of getting there.